I caught my bill stealing money from me a few years ago. Now he's broke and wants to move in with his wife, but I told him no. I've been married to my husband, Dan, for 12 years, and we have 2 kids together. I met Dan in my mid-20s when he was living with his younger brother, Bran. This was about 15 or 16 years ago, when Bran was still in college. As Dan and I began dating, he eventually asked me to move in with them. They were renting a spacious 2-bedroom condo, and Dan was covering the rent while managing his own expenses. Moving in with him would help with the rent. At the time, I was sharing an apartment with a colleague, which was far from Dan's place and quite expensive. Commuting was a hassle, and I was deeply in love. After 6 months of dating, moving in with Dan seemed like the right choice. Everything was smooth initially, but soon I started noticing small things missing. Money from my wallet and items from my closet. It began with just a few cents disappearing now and then. I should mention that I'm notoriously forgetful. I keep all my passwords in a diary and often forget to reply to messages for days, struggling to recall what I was supposed to do. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the missing money, thinking I might just be careless with my finances. The small items from my closet, makeup, in particular, were also vanishing, but I assumed I was just misplacing them at work. Eventually, I noticed that all the missing items were either new or barely used. I mentioned it to Dan, who suggested I might have left them at the office or that someone could be taking them from my bag at work or parties. He didn't think it was being stolen from the house, as it was just the 2 of us, and no one else came over regularly. My friends visited occasionally, but doubting them seemed unlikely. I convinced myself that the theft was happening at my workplace and became more cautious about my belongings. One day, I bought a new perfume and placed it in the closet. 2 days later, it was gone. That was the moment I was certain the theft was happening at home, and Bran seemed the likely culprit. I wanted to tell Dan, but without evidence it seemed too trivial to confront him. So I decided to set up a camera in my room, aimed at the closet where the items kept disappearing. I told Dan that I wanted to catch a friend who I suspected was taking my things. He wasn't thrilled about placing a camera in our private space, but since it didn't cover our bed, he agreed, likely because he was tired of my constant worries about the missing items. I installed the camera and invited some friends over for the weekend while Dan kept an eye on my friend. I knew who the real culprit was. Our friends got drunk and ended up crashing at our place. Eventually, Dan and I also fell asleep on the living room couch because there was no room left. Dan's friends had come over too, and 3 of them ended up in our bedroom. It sounds chaotic, but that's how we used to party in our mid-20s. Lots of people getting drunk and sleeping on a friend's couch. I'm not sure how it is now, but back then, house parties were usually packed with 10+ people. The next morning, when we reviewed the recordings, it was clear that Bran was the thief. He had seized the opportunity with so many people around, making it easy to deflect suspicion. Items like my new dress, an expensive clutch, several unused perfume bottles, and a few dollars were missing. I was relieved I had installed the camera as it revealed the truth about Dan's brother. Dan confronted Bran over the phone. Instead of showing remorse, Bran called me a b*** for recording him. I was furious and wanted to hit him, but I stayed calm, watching how Dan would handle the situation. We had been together for almost a year, and I wanted to see how he would deal with such a delicate issue. Dan slapped Bran hard for insulting me and demanded an apology. Bran, however, was so entitled that he didn't apologize. Instead, he accused me of invading their privacy and intruding into their lives. He felt that I had come between him and Dan and had done all this to drive me away. He admitted he had deliberately stolen the items and wasn't afraid of getting caught, confident that Dan would side with him and show me my place. Dan kicked him out of the house. After that, I decided to move out as well. Bran was Dan's brother, and I was just a girlfriend of a few months. We'd only known each other for a year. Dan insisted it wasn't about the length of our relationship but about what was right and wrong. Bran had clearly wronged me. That incident strengthened our bond and built a deeper trust in our relationship. Dan's parents tried to persuade him to let his brother Bran move in, but he was firm in his decision not to take him back. Now Bran has lost his job due to the pandemic and struggles with basic expenses. He's asking us to take him in. We live in a 3-bedroom house with our 2 kids, and there's 1 extra room since the kids share one. In a couple of years, they'll both need their own rooms. Bran's wife and 5-year-old son are also involved, and he insists that we let him stay in our extra room and his son in our kids' room. However, the kids' room isn't spacious enough for 3, and I don't want his child with mine. Bran is one of the most spoiled and pampered individuals I've ever met. He's never visited our house, thank goodness, but I've seen how he behaves at my in-laws. He and his wife don't even attempt to educate him or discipline him. I don't want such a child in my house. When Bran first approached Dan, he turned him down. Bran then brought his wife, Mill, to plead his case. He's using his sob story to gain sympathy and secure a place in our home. Bran had been working in retail, but the pandemic devastated the industry, and he lost his job. He lived off his savings for a year. When conditions improved, he applied for other jobs, but the next wave hit, and retail shut down again. Now he's asking us to take him in. Dan initially refused, but with Mill now involved, I worry that Dan might change his mind. This isn't just about the past, it's about the future we're trying to build. Even after 12 years of marriage, I'm still not on good terms with Bill and his family. I won't comment much on Bill's wife since we've had very limited interaction, but Bill has always been difficult with me, and his son is just as spoiled. I'm struggling to figure out how to handle this situation. Update 1. Responses to common questions from the last post. Where has Bill been all this time? After Dan evicted him from our apartment, Bill moved into his college dorm. He had minimal contact with Dan and none with me until Dan announced our engagement. Bill was the first to object, even spreading rumors about me to my in-laws, calling me controlling and domineering. He continued this behavior even after our wedding. Bill was invited to the wedding because it was organized with all my sisters and friends as bridesmaids and all of Dan's brothers and friends as groomsmen. It was nearly impossible to exclude Bran, so I reluctantly agreed to let him attend. He kept his distance from me, and I did the same. That was the extent of our interaction. Did he invite us to his wedding? No. Bill had a courthouse wedding, and only my parents-in-law were invited. It was a small, quick ceremony. The reason given was that it was a small, intimate affair, but according to family gossip, Bill's wedding was on a tight budget, and that's why no one else was invited. Bill doesn't earn enough, and his wife doesn't work, so all the financial burden falls on him. After Mill got involved, things became more complicated. She's been relentlessly pressuring my husband to let Bill move in with us. Dan initially tried to ignore it, but he eventually succumbed to the emotional pressure of helping his younger brother and supporting family. He came to me and confessed that his parents were pressuring him so much that it was becoming hard to refuse. He asked if there was any chance I would agree to let Bran stay with us. He was worried about the past issues. I asked him, do we know how long he'll stay with us? Because honestly, no one can predict when this pandemic will end. I asked my husband if Bill would contribute to groceries and other bills. We could overlook the house rent, but other expenses would increase. I questioned whether we had enough to feed 3 more people. He admitted we didn't. I explained that we couldn't let Bill's son go hungry while we fed our own children just because his father isn't earning. Plus, with Bill's wife not working, I couldn't supervise her use of our kitchen supplies. Letting Bill in wasn't just about our privacy or past grievances, it was also about practicality. We needed to sort out these issues before making any decision. Dan knew I wasn't ready for this, but he acknowledged that my concerns were valid. He said he would discuss these matters with Bill and Mill the next time they called and see what they could offer. I just hope Dan makes a thoughtful decision and doesn't overburden himself. Although we both have jobs and are grateful to still be employed, the uncertainty with the new virus variants is worrying. We need to save for the future. In this situation, we can't afford to take on extra burdens, especially from people who've never shown us love or respect. There's one more point I haven't shared with my husband yet, but if the situation arises, I plan to bring it up. My parents-in-law live in a spacious 2-bedroom house with an extra room used for storage. They could manage with one room while Bill and his wife take the other, and we could convert the storage room into a kid's den. If Mill is so concerned about Bill, she could offer to have them stay with her. Isn't that a bit hypocritical? Update 2. My husband discussed all our concerns with Bill, and my fears were confirmed. Bill has no intention of contributing to any household bills. He claims he can't afford it. I don't know how he's been managing to feed his family so far. Bill said, "You both still have jobs and earn. Can't you cover our expenses for a few months?" It was incredibly spineless of him to say that. We do earn, but that doesn't mean we're obligated to cover their expenses. It wasn't even a request anymore. It felt more like an entitlement. My husband told him we're not in a position to support 3 extra people. The next day, Mill called and insisted we sort this out. She claimed Bill was in serious crisis, and as a family, we should help him. She suggested we find a middle ground and added Bill to the call to discuss the matter. She proposed that we let them move in and they'd take care of themselves. Though Bill tried to object, Mill silenced him, saying, "First, get in the house, and then we'll figure it out." Her statement sounded suspicious and underhanded. I listened closely and told my husband that we couldn't let them in because their intentions seemed off. He muted the call to discuss this with me. Bill, thinking the call was disconnected, started cursing me. He told Mill that I was the manipulative B*******H who was preventing Dan from helping him. He said, "I told you, Mom. She's always been a control freak, using Dan as a puppet." She never liked my closeness with Dan. She manipulated Dan to throw me out of the apartment by falsely accusing me of stealing. My husband heard everything, as did I. There was no doubt left in his mind. He unmuted the call and told them he heard everything and that there was no way he was letting Bill stay with us. After hanging up, Mill called me separately and said, "What did you gain by making my son's life harder? He's already in so much trouble, and you're adding to it. What harm would it do to let him stay in your spare room? They're not robbers who'll steal your food and stuff." I was stunned by Bill's curses and Mill's continued insistence that I help him. She didn't stop him from using the derogatory term for me. I lost my composure and retorted, "If you're so moved by your son's misery, why don't you let him stay in your house? You have an extra room in your storehouse, after all." She didn't see that coming. After a moment of fumbling, she claimed that Bill was sensitive to noise and got headaches easily. Bill's 5-year-old son's chaos would disturb Phil. The truth came out. She knows how troublesome Bill's son is, and she doesn't want him around. What hypocrisy. She can't tolerate having her grandchild around but expects me to put up with his mischief. I told her as much and she started fuming. She said I was just assuming things and accusing her falsely. She claimed she didn't volunteer because of Phil, who gets anxious with any minor chaos. At his age, in his 80s, he wants a peaceful life. I responded that everyone is entitled to a peaceful life, at least in their own home, and she was trying to take that away from us. She suggested it could be an opportunity for Bill's son to learn manners and discipline from my children. I countered, "What if my children get influenced negatively? You know children pick up bad habits more easily than good ones." When she could no longer argue, she said, "Bran was right. You're indeed manipulative and strong-headed. No wonder my son can't make any decisions on his own. You're so dominant." I replied, "Maybe he listens to me because I speak logic and not nonsense like you guys." She hung up, cursing me. I told my husband about the call. He asked me not to dwell on it. We've made up our minds not to let them in and disrupt our peaceful life. I just hope he remains firm in his decision and doesn't succumb to their pressure. Update 3. A week after the call, Bill's wife called me. She greeted me very politely and gently. It didn't sound pretentious. She seemed genuinely sincere, or at least she appeared to be. She told me she was aware of everything that had happened. I felt a bit embarrassed about denying them entry to my house, yet she was so polite and composed. She said, "I understand your concerns and I don't want to burden you, but we really need help. We've exhausted all our savings covering basic needs like rent and other essentials." She mentioned she was taking a job at a restaurant to survive. I didn't ask what kind of job it was. Since she's not a chef, I assumed it was a counter position. I wondered about the pay. She said she had been urging Bill to take any available job, but he refused to do odd jobs, preferring to stay jobless and rely on others instead. That was ridiculous. I won't deny that I felt for her situation, but she said she didn't want us to offer any favors because Bill would become more careless if he received help without working for it. I sighed in relief because after such an intense conversation, it would have been hard for me to turn her down. She then asked if she could borrow some money from me, promising to repay it in installments. She mentioned that the apartment they were living in was available for lease at a discounted price due to the pandemic's impact on retail properties. She wanted to lease the house to save on monthly rent. The deal made sense, but she didn't have the total amount up front. I told her I couldn't commit right away and needed to discuss it with my husband. She asked us to keep it confidential, explaining that Bill was furious with her for asking us. She mentioned that although we hadn't had the chance to bond, she felt a warmth towards me and thought I could be helpful. I assured her I would keep it to ourselves and would get back to her after discussing it with Dan. When I spoke with my husband, the first question he asked was, "Do I believe her?" He pointed out the risk, suggesting that Bran might be using her to get money from us, especially since he had burned bridges with us. It made sense. There was a possibility that I was being tricked, so I decided to drop the idea. I was hoping she would follow up, as Bill used to do, but weeks passed and I didn't hear from her. Guilty of admitting it, I almost forgot about it amid work and the kids. One day, while mindlessly scrolling through social media, I remembered the situation. I texted her to ask if she had managed to gather the money for the lease. She replied, "No." I apologized and was about to explain that I had forgotten to respond, but she said she understood that she couldn't expect any favors from me after what Bill had done. That's why she hadn't followed up. I felt a shiver down my spine and felt terrible. I called her and apologized. She said it was fine and didn't request the money. She was still polite and gentle. I asked for her account details to make the transfer, but she refused, saying it was fine. I insisted and she mentioned they were due to vacate the house in a few days and weren't sure if the owner had leased it out to someone else. I asked her to check as soon as possible. She was hesitant, but I assured her that I trusted her and was ready to lend. She agreed and hung up. She called me back after a while, relieved to tell me the house was still available and now at a slightly cheaper rate because the owner wasn't getting any takers due to the COVID crisis. I was so relieved. I made the transfer and asked her to finalize the deal with the property owner without discussing it with my husband this time. I was determined to help her out. After the paperwork was done, she called again to thank me and assured me she would repay the money in installments. Curious, I asked her what she had told Bill. She said she had told him she borrowed the money from her employer and that it would be deducted from her salary each month. She explained that if she mentioned my name, Bill would refuse to pay. I inquired about their plans after vacating the house. She mentioned they were planning to move in with her mom in the suburbs, quite far from the city and her workplace, but she had no other option. Although there wasn't enough space for three, her mom had agreed to let them stay. Bill, however, was not ready to move in there and was negotiating with Mill to let them stay with us instead, but she was refusing. I wanted to ask how her son became so pampered and why he didn't listen to anyone, but before I could, she mentioned that Bill had spoiled the kid to the point where he didn't even listen to her. She said he didn't let her discipline him, and if she ever tried to scold him, he would lash out at her. I wanted to ask why she married him and why she hadn't divorced him yet, but that felt too personal and I didn't want to hurt her. I suspected that he had been the reason she hadn't worked until now, and now that she was earning, it was only a matter of time before she kicked him out. She told me she would be leasing the house in her name, which seemed like part of her plan. I'll be glad to know when she finally gets rid of him.